that is what I found. I mean, there are people who go around and it's almost like the goal is to tell stories. They say, let's get into storytelling. We need some storytelling. But it's kind of looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Your goal is not to tell stories necessarily. It's to capture people's attention.
Welcome to the Conversion Aid Podcast, where we help software entrepreneurs to take their business to the next level. Each week, we interview proven industry experts who share their strategies and insights to help you create software that sells. Here's your host, Omer Khan.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Conversion Aid Podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about storytelling and how you can use it to grab people's attention and get more customers. It seems that we're all getting more and more overwhelmed with content these days. More blog posts are being published, more people are doing content marketing, more emails are being sent, more tweets, shares, likes. And it's no different for our customers. They're overwhelmed with information. And if you want to grab their attention, then storytelling is a perfect way to do that. In this episode, we're going to talk about what exactly storytelling is, how all of us have stories that we can tell. We'll share some hacks on how you can find stories of your own. And we'll go through a step-by-step process for using those stories to grab people's attention and get more customers. Before we get started, if you haven't joined the Conversion Aid community, now is a great time to do that. You'll get notified of new episodes right in your inbox, and it's a great way to learn from successful SaaS founders and entrepreneurs. Just go to conversionaid.com/VIP and enter your email address to join. All right, let's get on with the interview. All right, today's guest is the Associate Director of Gatehouse, a UK-based communication agency. He speaks regularly and talks about how to build an audience and use storytelling to capture people's attention. And he's the author of the book, Hooked on You, The Genius Way to Make Anybody Read Anything. In his book, he explains why storytelling matters in the business world and how you can use storytelling to get people's attention and eventually turn them into your customers. So whether you're writing emails, blog posts, or landing page copy, you'll discover how storytelling can help you be more effective at getting customers. So today, I'd like to welcome Ian Harris. Ian, welcome to the show.
Hi, Omer. I'm really pleased to be here, and it all sounds great when you put it like that. So, thanks for the intro.
I should have used a story to introduce you. That would have been even better. All right. So tell me about the book. Like, how did that sort of come about, and why did you write that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm from like a lot of my clients now are these kind of big corporate clients. The boring guys. So like Ernst & Young and like the kind of big four accounting firms. But in the past, like my background was from the internet marketing world, right? So all the kind of, like people like Frank Kern and Perry Marshall and, those kind of like, this kind of like gurus of the internet marketing world. And I would like follow them and be obsessed with all the kind of latest like stuff they were promoting. And I'd always like get emails from them and get their communications. And I'd always just read them first. And I always wondered why they were so magnetic and why they caught my attention. And then I realized it was because they were just telling interesting stories. And they were sort of talking about a world that was very different from the kind of world that I was in. I was working in a job and I was kind of eating a sandwich at my computer and sort of slowly dying inside. And so it was very, it was just very interesting to me how they captured my attention. Do you know the guys I'm talking about? This kind of whole,
the guys in like either internet marketing. I know Frank and Perry Marshall. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, all those kind of names, and I used to kind of like follow. I mean, I still do it, just follow all that stuff, and they tell stories really well. And I was just interested. I started looking at storytelling and researching it, and what I found was a lot of people talking about like the theory behind storytelling, like, the kind of, the hero's journey, and like how Star Wars and it conforms to this, like, the hero with 1,000 faces. There's this kind of like monomyth, this kind of complicated structure of how stories should be. You've got to have, like, there's a call to adventure, and in a story there's the test of time, and there's the kind of mysterious cave, and there's got to be the kind of guru at the top of the mountain, and there's all these like elements of storytelling, and it was just so complicated. I couldn't figure any of it out. It was like, it seemed to be just for movie script writers, and all I could find about storytelling was, when you tell stories, it releases a chemical in the brain, and it was all kind of very sciencey and theoretical, and I couldn't find anywhere that just told you how to do it, in simple, practical terms. So I decided to kind of, just study all my favorite writers, figure out the techniques they were using, and just see if I could, write a really practical, tactical manual of how to get someone's attention with a story. And that's what I've tried to do in Hooked on You, my book. And I even give away like a big list of stories so that you can just go away and start telling stories and making your point with them. So I wanted to make storytelling as very simple and step by step as possible. That was the goal with it.
Yeah, and I think that's what I love about the book, and the stories you mentioned. We'll share some of those stories as we talk. But that's what I liked about your book, and how you provide like a very simple kind of framework for anybody to be able to tell a great story. And I know there are probably people listening to this saying, yeah, but I'm not very good at telling stories. And I think by the end of this episode, you might be surprised how well you can tell a story. And I think when you were talking about that, I remembered sort of being in the corporate world. And I remember having a meeting with somebody who was a potential hiring manager for a different job that I was looking at, internally. And he asked me, we really want to sort of change the way we're kind of approaching building these products, and we really want to do more storytelling. And he was like, well, how are you with that? And, tell me a story. And I was just like, what? And I was like, what the fuck? What do I do? Right. And so I had no idea. And I kind of like waffled around, came up with something which was completely incoherent. And eventually just said, you know what, I can't tell you a story. And it was just this really kind of embarrassing moment. And I was just like, wow, I really suck at this. And I remember speaking to someone, I think it maybe was my wife, and sort of told her about the experience. And she was like, you tell stories every day. So what are you talking about? And she said, everything, you can't just say things like, you can't just give me a piece of information. You always have to wrap it around some kind of story to kind of make it more interesting. And I wish she was more direct sometimes, but that's a different topic. We can talk about that another time. And it was because I had that same kind of preconceived notion about storytelling. When someone says to me storytelling, I'm thinking about, oh, well, I always hear about this concept of a story arc and a beginning and sort of a protagonist and how do I weave that into talking about software, right? And it's nothing like that. And it's just about, we're all telling stories all the time and we don't even realize it. And I think that's hopefully what I want to kind of get through with this conversation. Not only helping people realize that they do have a lot of stories to tell, but more importantly, how they can use them to be more effective with their writing, whether it is an email or a blog post or a landing page, as I mentioned earlier, and how you can use writing to actually get more customers.
Yeah, I mean, that anecdote you said is so funny because, that is what I found. I mean, there are people who go around and it's almost like the goal is to tell stories. They say, let's get into storytelling. We need some storytelling. But it's kind of looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Your goal is not to tell stories necessarily. It's to capture people's attention, or it might be to kind of build a relationship. or it might be to kind of cut through the noise. And stories are great for that. But there are means to an end. I mean, they can build. I've built my audience through just telling stories. But my goal is to build the audience, not tell stories. So you get these people who are sort of they give TED Talks on storytelling and stuff. And the way they describe it is exactly as you say. They talk about this, the kind of hero's journey and things like this. But it's like the keeper of the secret flame. They don't really want to. Yeah. They want to kind of have this myth around storytelling, but I kind of want to strip away all that. And the stories are great, but what's great about them, the reason they're great is because they can build you a big audience and they can make people really want to pay attention to you. So, I mean...
Are you familiar with Andre Chaperon?
I'm not. No, but his name rings a bell, actually.
Yeah, so he's kind of a email marketing kind of expert, I guess, and everything he does is around storytelling, and he's very good at telling stories. He's the kind of person, if you want to kind of get an example and you're listening to this, is search for Andre Chaperon. I'll include a link in the show notes and sign up for one of his emails, and you'll kind of get the idea of what I mean, because he's kind of really taken the whole concept of what TV writers do in terms of, there's a big overall story with a TV series, and then each episode has kind of like a mini story, and they leave kind of these concepts of open loops, where at the end of the episode there's some kind of open loop, which is sort of something unfinished, which kind of makes you want to go and watch the next episode. And he does a really good job at doing that, to the point where when I get an email from him, I kind of open it up before anything else just to read the story. So I think that's a really good example. But even then, in terms of what he does, I think is a little bit more sophisticated than maybe what I think most people listening to this really need to do. And so I think that the framework that you've got is a really, really great starting point, because it doesn't take a lot of work or a lot of years of study to kind of figure out how to do that. Before we get into that, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say you're exactly right, and the bar is very low, right? I mean, like I in my industry, I publish this kind of email newsletter, and the goal is to kind of market my services, right? Ultimately, but instead, I kind of just tell stories about that I think will resonate with that audience. So a lot of my audience are in the kind of communication industry, and they I know that a lot of these people don't recognize how important their job is. There's a certain field that I serve called internal communication, and those are the kind of audience that I'm building. And a lot of people don't recognize the value of what they do. They think they're just the people who put the signs up that say the toilet's broken. They don't realize they've got like a real strategic function. They don't realize they're important. So I kind of tell stories about that. And like one of the stories was 100 years ago, if you ate a lobster, it was like eating a rat, right? It was gross. Like lobsters were this awful, filthy creature. And in many states in the United States, it was illegal to serve prisoners lobster because it was a cruel and unusual punishment.
Wow.
And so I put that in an email, and I said, in our industry, we're the lobsters, because a long time ago in our industry, it was a cruel and unusual punishment because it was seen as such a kind of silly job. But now, we're kind of this delicacy, and we're kind of a very important job, and our fortunes have kind of done a 180-degree pivot. So that's kind of an example of how to use stories to kind of build like a professional audience and kind of get on their side. but yeah, we can go into that a bit more later on.
Yeah, and I think that's good, because I think if we just kind of, sort of deconstruct that, you could have just said the second part of that, provided the information in terms of, hey, our jobs used to be like this and now they're like this. But that's not as powerful as when you sort of tell that little story about the lobster. Right. So I think that's kind of so my question really was, we were going to continue this conversation, was in the context of what we're talking about, what is a story? And I think you just gave an example there, but do you have a definition for how you think about those?
Well, I mean, do you know what? The short answer is no, I don't. It's anything that gets somebody, creates a movie in someone's mind, right? I mean, what you've got to remember is that most people don't lead very exciting lives, okay? They're not like, they're not like you kind of hosting a rock and roll podcast, and like living this kind of entrepreneur lifestyle. They've got a job and they lead lives of quiet desperation, right? I mean, that's kind of a cynical way to look at it, but most people don't do many exciting things during the day, okay? So for me, like particularly with the audiences I serve, I'm trying to build an audience of people in big enterprises who can kind of spend money with me at the end of the day. They don't hear many stories, So like a lot of the stories I try and tell are about universes that they will find exciting. So music or art or entertainment or space travel, and then I tell them a little story, and then I pivot out of it into the thing I want to tell them. So I'll say like, well, it's like that in our industry, and then I'll just make up a reason why it's like that in our industry. And what happens over time, as you found with Andre Chaperon, paying attention to his emails, over time they kind of come to expect a little treat every time they open an email from you, because they think, oh, this is going to take me somewhere. This is going to, I'm going to go on a journey for like 2 or 3 minutes, and it's going to be exciting. And if you think about most people's inboxes, they're a really unusual place. It's where everything comes together. So you've got emails from your friends and family and your boss and Amazon, and the way, like, a lot of people treat their inbox is just like a Twitter feed. It's kind of catch what you can, and then it's gone off the front page and you'll never see it. But people don't sort their emails chronologically anymore. They go straight to, they don't even look at the subject. They look at the name. So if you can become a person in someone's life who has a reputation for sharing interesting things, then you'll always be the person they open first. And the way, I suppose there's lots of ways to do that, but the way I know that's worked for me is just by finding interesting stories and sharing them with people. And it's really no more complicated than that,
Yeah. So let's kind of break it down for people a little bit. So you kind of talk about the concept of a hook and a bridge. So maybe we can kind of work through one example and see how people could do that.
Shall I give you an example of one? So here's an example of like a story that I might share, and this could be in an email, or it could be in a speech. Like if you tap me on the shoulder now and said, there's 500 people waiting for you to give a 15-minute talk, and I had no idea what to do. I could just say some of these stories and I probably wouldn't die,
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me give you an example. Okay. In the 60s, there was, the space race, and NASA had a problem. And the problem they had was that astronauts couldn't write in space, because ordinary pens, they wouldn't work in zero gravity, like the ink won't flow or something. So there's this story about how NASA tried to solve this problem, and they hired a guy called Paul Fisher, and he designed a pen that would write in space. It cost, I think it took 6 months, and it cost like $1.5 million, but he did it. He made this pen that would write in zero gravity. And now, meanwhile, the Russians, the story goes that the Russians had the same problem. but they used a pencil.
Yeah.
And now the story, I mean, as it happens, there's a bit more to the story than that. I mean, they did know about using a pencil, but the lead would chip off and go in the instruments and stuff. But I tell people that, and I say, well, the reason that story is you still hear it around today is because it just illustrates this universal truth, right? Smart people waste time often creating these elaborate solutions to problems when a simple answer is right under their nose. So that's an example of a story. And then I can just say, well, so here's a bridge, right? So how do I go from that story? So I've got someone's attention.
So what you just described there with the NASA story is the hook.
Yeah.
Right? Now we're kind of looking for a bridge in terms of, okay, why are you telling me this?
Yeah. So if I end it there, so so the story is what I call a hook. So that's, if you open an email or if you open a blog post or if you open a speech with a story, during the 1960 space race, NASA hit a problem. Now you're going to be engaged for the next 2 minutes at least. So it hooks you into your seat and it captures your attention. So you come to the end of the story, but if you leave it there, fine. But where's the relevance? You have to kind of arrive at some kind of point for your audience. Otherwise, they'll eventually just tune out and there's no value there. So, but you can't just attach your the thing you really want to talk about, because the two don't really go together. It's kind of a bit jarring. So what you need is a bit of glue to fix them together. And I call that glue a bridge. And a bridge is a really simple thing. It's like one sentence. And I'll give you some examples of bridges now. So a bridge might be, I love this story because it shows, or it's the same in our industry, blah. Or clearly there's an important lesson here for us, blah. And then you just go into your point. So it's very easy. What you find is that any kind of story that you find, and we'll go on to where to find these stories shortly, but any story that you find, you would be amazed how flexible those can be. You can make almost any point you want to from them if you just use one of those bridges to kind of pivot out of it.
Yeah, I really like that. And that, I think that's what it really boils down to, right? Is having the hook, which is the short story. And as we said, by story, it doesn't mean all the complexity and some long-winded thing which takes you, 20 pages to kind of explain. It's just an example of something, an anecdote, an experience, something that people can imagine as an experience in their own minds while you're telling them, right? I think that's about as simple as it needs to be. And while you were telling that, and I want to talk about where to get ideas for these stories, but when you start thinking the way I think that you recommend people do in your book, which is really about collecting the stories that you can use later. We'll talk about that as well. It becomes a much more, it becomes a lot easier to think about how you're going to use these things. And you'll realize that as you go about your day-to-day activities, you're going to notice a whole bunch of stories that you could use sometime in the future. And I'll just give you one example of this. It's like when I was living in London, I remember going down to the sort of going down to Edgware Road near Marble Arch, right? And there was some new fried chicken place that had opened up, and I kind of went in there and kind of placed an order, and they got my order. No, they took my order, and then they told me after they'd taken my money, we're just cooking it, but it'll be ready in 2 minutes. And I said, okay, but the fryer that they were using for the chicken, I could see the timer on that was set to like 12 minutes, right? And so suddenly I've got this thing about, well, you just told me 2 minutes and 12 minutes, so I know I'm going to be here for at least 12 minutes before you take that stuff out. It's like you could have asked me before you took my money whether I still wanted to wait 12 minutes for that chicken or not. And just even just a silly example like that, you can kind of tie into, things like customer service, right? In terms of setting people's expectations correctly. And, if you kind of mislead people, what the issues are. So I think there's a whole bunch of things that just come out from a simple experience like that. So I think it's great to go out and look for these stories and the NASA stories, and let's talk about how to do that. But I think all of us in our day-to-day lives will find we have a ton of potential stories we can tell.
Yeah, and it's when you start getting tuned into this stuff, you suddenly it flips a switch in your mind, and you're suddenly just looking out for little experiences that you've had and thinking, well, how could I share this with someone? Like, how could I use this to captivate an audience? And I don't know, like there's a writer called Stephen Pressfield, and he talks about he wrote a book about writing, and it's really great. It's called The War of Art, I think. And he says that when you tell the universe you're looking for something, the universe tries to help you. And he talks about like it's angels doing it and stuff. And I'm not sure that I want to go that far, but I think that's true. I think it's called the reticular activating system in your brain. When you thinking of buying a red car, all of a sudden you see red cars everywhere. And what you describe is absolutely true. I mean, when you start getting into telling stories and using them to capture people's attention, so you can sell them stuff or build a relationship with them or whatever you want to do, all of a sudden the world just seems to be full of stories that you can use. And yeah, you're right that they're really flexible. You can use them to kind of describe or explain almost anything.
So you, as I said earlier, you kind of recommend that people kind of create this sort of swipe file where, a Word doc, a Google Doc, whatever, and start collecting these stories to use sometime in the future. So where, beyond sort of looking within sort of our own lives, where else can people go out and start looking for stories to collect?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know about you, but the hardest part for me when I have to write something is getting started. I'm staring at that blank page, and I just, once I've got the thing that's the hook, once I've got the thing that's going to get their attention, I'm fine. But it's just getting started that is a problem. So what I do is that I kind of I started just collecting stories that I thought, oh, that's quite an interesting thing. That's a really arresting image, that would capture someone's attention. So maybe I could use that in the future. And I started just pasting them into a Word document. And over time, I realized that I was relying on this Word document more and more, to the point where I decided to kind of make a conscious effort to build this thing. And it's got to the point where anytime I have something to write, before I go into Microsoft Word, I kind of, that blank page, I go into my swipe file, I call it. And I just go shopping and I pick a story and I just copy and paste it in. And then that's my beginning. So it just completely changes the way you write things. It makes it almost like going shopping, and it speeds it up so much. So, but yeah, what I could do is kind of give you some ideas about where to find these stories, if that's okay.
Yeah, great.
Or in fact, maybe I'll just. I mean, I'm looking through my swipe file right now. I'll give you a few little examples of stuff that's in there. So there's a fact I found about Paul McCartney, and he said that one of the biggest myths about the Beatles was that they were these anti-materialistic hippies, But there's a quote from him, and he says, "No, John Lennon and I literally used to sit down together and say, let's write ourselves a swimming pool." So that was their motivation in writing a lot of these songs. And I know a lot of artists, and they're always struggling to kind of commercialize their work. So if I ever have to address that topic, I'm going to come back and get that paragraph out of my swipe file. I also found a fact about if you buy a turtle and you put it in a little aquarium, it will only grow to a size that fits the tank. So if you want a bigger turtle, you need a bigger tank. Now, I haven't used that fact yet, but if I have to communicate like an office move, or if I have to talk about how a company is growing, or, you know, that's going to be a good kind of visual metaphor for that. So that's kind of in there waiting as well. So is that making sense? I've just got all these little nuggets in there waiting to be deployed.
Yeah, and so I was just going to say, I just kind of looking at a screenshot that you had in your book. It kind of just looks, the swipe file just looks like a Word document. It's a table with 2 columns. The first column is, you know, anything from a couple of sentences to a couple of paragraphs, which kind of tell a story that you've collected. And then in the second column, you've kind of just put some kind of keywords as a reminder of potential ways to use the.
I think what you're seeing is all the other little notes I've got about what I need to buy at the shop and stuff like that. It is literally just randomly pasted stuff. And I do training on this for people, and every time someone says, you know, why don't you have a database for this with tags? And I'm like, I know I should do that, but I'm just too lazy. So and I like the kind of serendipitousness. I'm not sure if that's a word, of just going through this and just truffling around and seeing what I can find. Just one more. There's I heard this story about Steve Jobs when he came back to Apple in 1997. One of his first decisions was to get rid of the Apple Museum that used to be in the lobby, in the foyer when people walked through the front door of Apple. He said that he didn't want to be at a company that was living in its past. You know, because Apple used to really celebrate all the old Macs, and they used to kind of have this little museum. And he said he didn't want the future of the company to be affected by the best thinking of its history. He wanted to be living up to the best thinking of the future. And of course, after that period, you know, you got the first iMac and you got the iPod, and Apple just took off. So I'm kind of waiting to use that for when I need to talk about how a company needs to be look to the future rather than just rest on its laurels or something like that. So that's the idea of a swipe file. Collects a load of stuff, and it just helps you write faster. Now, where do you find all this stuff? Okay, that's the $1 million question. And for me, the best resource that I found is biographies and autobiographies. A book about somebody is essentially just a collection of cool stories from their life, right? So I've had a lot of success reading autobiographies of musicians, so like the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, anyone that people tend to admire or find exciting is a really good target. A great thing to do is if say you serve a particular audience, is to just to go out and ask people who their heroes are, and they'll tell you all sorts of names, and you can kind of go off and read a book about one of those people and collect lots of interesting stories about them, because 9 times out of 10 people who will tell you who, you know, this is my hero, they've not really read up on them very much, because a lot of people, I don't know why, they're not very widely read. So when you can play back stories about their hero and then align that with your message, you know, it works like gangbusters. I'll give you an example. So I was doing some research into an audience that I wanted to kind of write for, and I said, you know, who's your hero? And this guy said, he was like a sales guy, and he said Valentino Rossi. And I had no idea who Valentino Rossi is. Have you heard of him?
Wasn't he a racing car driver or something?
Yeah, he was like a motorbike racer. Yeah. I don't have the vocabulary to describe what he does, but he was like the best motorbike racer ever. He raced for Honda, who made like the best motorbikes, and he won, I think, the World Biking Championship like 5 times in a row. He was completely unprecedented. And then one day, completely out of the blue, he announced that he was switching teams to Yamaha, who at the time made these like really crappy bikes, and everybody thought were awful. And people were sure he didn't have this $5 million super bike he was going to lose. But he amazed everyone, of course, by going on to win this trophy even more times. And people said to him, Rossi, why did you switch from Honda to Yamaha, the best team to the worst team? And he said, it's because I wanted to prove that it was man and not machine. And I got that story. I wouldn't have got that story unless I'd found out from this guy who his hero was. And it turns out a lot of people in his market also kind of admired sporting figures like that. And when I used that in some messaging, it works so well. I mean, if you ever use like an email delivery program, you can see how many people open stuff. And I think this one had like a 300% open rate, which meant that people were forwarding it on to other people and it was being opened multiple times. But that's kind of the power, because I think in his market, no one would ever talk about like a racing driver, in their messaging. They would just kind of talk about, well, God knows what they talk about, but whenever you can find a world that's very interesting and exciting to people, if you can bring that to people in a story, then they'll pay attention to you. So biographies are my kind of go-to way to get cool stories. Now, the problem with reading books, I will say, is number one, you have to buy them, and number two, you have to read them.
Yeah.
So I found this kind of weird little hack about to kind of save a bit of time. What you can do, on a Kindle, you can highlight stuff.
Yep.
I don't know if you've got a Kindle. You can, yeah. Well, did you know that, like, you can go on to this website called kindle.amazon.com, and you can see all the stuff that you've highlighted. So you can kind of go back to it, and you can see it through this web interface, and it's really good. But what it will also let you do is see the popular stuff that other people have highlighted. And that's useful because it will let you see that even if you've not purchased the book. So, like, if I type in Nelson Mandela into kind of this part of Amazon, it will bring up all the books about Nelson Mandela. And if I click it, it will show me the popular highlights, the most popular passages in that book. And what people tend to highlight, I find, is the best stories or the best, quotes or anecdotes. So in a way, you're kind of getting the readers of Amazon to do your job for you, finding the best stuff. And this is a really cool part. It doesn't work for every book for some reason, because it needs like some kind of critical mass of people to highlight it for this to work. But on books about Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, it works. And so the URL is kindle.amazon.com, and you just got to sign in with your Amazon account, and then you can do that there. So that's kind of a good tip to find the best stuff from books. The other resource to find all these cool stories is the subreddit Today I Learned. So I think the URL is reddit.com/r/Today I Learned. And what that forum is just an army of online nerds just sharing the weirdest stories they found. So I think I found so one I found in there, someone told me like Prince, here's one. So someone told me that at Disney World, if you ever go to Disney World, at the end of the day, they play the background music a little bit faster. So they speed up the background music to get people to go to the exits faster, to get people out of the park. And it's a subtle thing, but I love that fact that I found on there. And I've used it a couple of times. One was at EY, the audit accountancy firm, to describe why we were going to suddenly start increasing the pace of our communications about a certain topic. And people kind of love that little hook. But that Reddit forum is a great place just to find unusual little facts and anecdotes that you wouldn't find anywhere else. And most people, like in our community, a lot of people are on Reddit and they know their Reddit usernames. But in the real world, in the actual world, people have no idea what Reddit is, I find. they've never heard of it, so they're never going to find this stuff. And it's just a great resource. So that's those are my sort of two go-to places.
Okay, so biographies, Reddit. We talked about the Kindle highlights at kindle.amazon.com. And then I guess what we talked about earlier as well is just in terms of your own personal experiences that you may have a lot of stuff in your own life that's happening, which you kind of become more sort of authentic stories that you can share. It doesn't necessarily have to be about somebody else.
Yeah, and I find they work once people know you, right? So if you've got like a warm audience and they've kind of enjoyed your stories and they've kind of got you categorized as somebody that they're going to pay attention to because you don't bore them and you don't waste their time and you just share relevant, interesting things with them, then they'll listen to you. They'll listen to a story about your personal life. If people don't know you, it's harder because they just think, I don't care about this person's experience. So, like the reason I go for like the reason I try and read books about Stevie Wonder or Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones is because I want to like open my message with their name, or NASA. I want to open with something that is just a big stick.
So people see NASA or Stevie Wonder, they're much more likely to get engaged than
this is
Ian and Omer had for dinner yesterday.
Yeah, yes, because you're competing with whatever the 20 other tabs they've got in Chrome, or you just want to kind of grab their eyeballs and just say, hey, look at this. This is going to be an interesting story that's going to take you somewhere that is exciting. And once you have that trust, then you can definitely tell resonant stories that you've just experienced in your own life. But I'd be careful about doing that until I'd earned that reputation. Like a good example of this, there's a guy I think you and I both follow called Perry Marshall, and he's another great guy to follow because he sends these amazing emails about and he talks about his experience when he was a kid of building speakers from scratch, and I just find them really interesting, and there's a lot I get from them. And I forwarded it to I've been following this guy for like, as I'm sure you have, for a few years, and I forwarded one of his emails one day to someone I work with who kind of thinks like me, but he's never heard of this guy, Perry Marshall. And I said, this is the definition of a fantastic story. And he was like, are you kidding? I just lost, I couldn't read it. It was too long and it was boring and I didn't. And it's because it's the same email, but it's just he didn't have the respect for the guy that I did.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, you've got to, you can do it. I mean, and I'm sure, and one example is the best ones are still stories that you found that are about somebody else. So I'll give you an example. Like I know this woman who she decided to become a freelance writer to kind of make ends meet and stuff, and she left this difficult relationship to bring up her kid on her own, and she took on some writing work, and it was difficult because clients would they kind of haggle the bill and they wouldn't really respect her and they'd always pay her late, and it just wasn't working that well. And she told me that one day she decided to try something different, and she made one little change to the way she worked, and the change that she made was she changed her name, right? And the name she chose was James Chartrand, and she she said almost instantly. I've got this written down somewhere, but almost instantly it was like night and day. Like clients paid on time. They didn't haggle the bill. They didn't ask for silly little changes, and they didn't nitpick her work. And so taking on a man's name kind of completely changed her business. And it's just amazing. I mean, this was in like 2012, but it's just amazing that that she should still have to do that. I mean, women have been using a male pen name for centuries, but it's just astonishing that in this day and age that's still true. And I kind of observed this story, and I thought and sometimes I'm asked to speak at events where I know there's a lot of women, because in my audience is there's quite a lot of it's quite a female audience, and I always, I often kind of tell that story because it's just such I call it like a sandwich dropper. It's such a kind of people can't believe it, and if I hadn't been tuned into this whole storytelling thing, I just wouldn't have been buzzing around in my mind as a potential candidate to get people's attention. So yeah, your life is almost certainly full of amazing stuff, but you've just got to, as you said, you've just got to kind of tune into it, and just, for me, the key thing is writing it down and keeping it in a little list, because you never know when you'll get the opportunity to use stuff. And in fact, you'll actually start looking for opportunities to use these stories. That's what I found. You actually start with the story and then figure out what you want to communicate with it, because the story is so good, it's burning a hole in your pocket.
Good. Okay, cool. So a couple more things I want to cover. One is let's kind of talk a little bit about how you would apply this to, say, writing a blog post, because that's something that a lot of people listening to this might be something that they want to or need to do. So how can we incorporate the hook and the bridge and the story into a blog post? And then secondly, I want to kind of cover how you use what you're teaching here to get business yourself. So how do you go about, does every blog post you write start with a story?
Yeah, because I suppose your goal with a blog, it is, I mean, sometimes you have a specific thing that you're trying to communicate, but I don't know about you, but for me, the goal of a blog post is often just, well, number one, just to put a blog post up, and number two, to kind of warm up the relationship a little bit more, just to kind of get me more attention, or in the hope that people will share it. So I don't have a specific goal to necessarily teach a specific thing, but it's just part of my relationship marketing campaign, or my content marketing strategy. So I always open with a story, and I'll kind of write the story, and then I'll sort of sit there for about 10 minutes thinking what points I can make with that story. And I know and at first I thought I must be really weird, because that's really back to front. But then a few other people have told me that they do the same thing as well. And actually, I found out that's how songwriting works. And this is really strange. Like when I don't know about you, but I always imagined when people write a song, they write the words to the song, and then they sort of get the melody around it. But I found out it's the other way around. Like when the Beatles wrote Yesterday, they got, I think Paul McCartney said he got the melody first. So and he was humming it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and the words were just like a placeholder. I think the placeholder words he used were scrambled eggs, scrambled eggs. And then, once he got the melody, he kind of filled in some words like, oh, yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. And people think the words are the starting point, but it's not, it's the melody. And the same is true when I'm writing a blog post or anything really. It's that melody of the story that's there first. And then I just think of kind of a point that I want to make.
Yeah, and I'm sure when you pick a story, you kind of intuitively know that story is going to fit in some way with what point you want to make. Because, I think obviously there's going to be some situations where you couldn't pick any story and try to bridge it, right? Because some things wouldn't make sense at all. And people would just be like, completely turned off by it. But so I guess that there is some kind of intuitive kind of feeling that this is the right thing to do, and then within that you're kind of looking for a specific way to kind of bridge to making that point.
Yeah, because the audience that you serve, you get to know who they are, and you end up, what you find is that you end up finding stories that are kind of tuned to resonate with those people. Like a lot of people in my audience are, they sort of have this feeling that they're a bit misunderstood or underappreciated. You know, they feel like people are always meddling with their work, and because they're like communicators, or they're in this kind of field of HR, everybody else thinks they can do their job. So I kind of look for stories that like pick that scab, you know. So I'll give you an example. Like I was reading. Have you ever read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
I've tried several times.
You've tried to, yeah. Yeah. Well, I also didn't make it all the way through, but I did get one thing from it. He's saying that if you ever look at a mechanic working on like a car, he looks really grumpy, and the reason he looks grumpy is not because, you know, it's manual labor and he hates it. It's because he doesn't want to be interrupted, because he's looking at this car and he's like, there's lots of diagnostic models going through in his head, and he's working through this kind of process, and it's a very like intellectual thing. It's not a blue collar grunt work at all. It's a very cerebral thing. But people always think that mechanics are just these grease monkeys, but they're not. And the same is true in a lot of professions. People look at what somebody does, and they just see what's on the surface. They don't really appreciate all the, you know, complexity that goes underneath it. And that's such a, and I use that story because it's such a universal thing that people feel. They just don't feel that people understand them. So, you know, anytime you can find like this universal, I call them hot button topics. Like anytime you can find a hot button topic that when you talk about it to someone, they just go, "Oh my God, yes, that's exactly, you completely understand me." Then that's a very powerful thing. So I'll kind of tend to look for stories that push my audience's buttons in that way, so they'll feel that like I'm on their side and I understand them. Yeah. And that kind of we've found that gets us a lot of attention and a lot of business.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what sort of how are you using this more to kind of get business yourself?
So what we do is we have this like weekly, like, I mean, it's an email newsletter, you know, and it goes out, and it's an autoresponder sequence. So I guess a lot of people might know what that is. If you don't know,
I think most people will be familiar with that. So.
Yeah. Okay. So we just have these like stories that are queued up, and they sign up for like a lead magnet, so like a little ebook or something, and then every week they get pinged another story. And there are other kind of agencies that do what we do, and if you look at their email newsletters, you know, it comes through and it's like a template, like a MailChimp template, and it's got like the logo at the top, and it's got like, "Welcome to this week's newsletter." You know, it's been a busy week, and there's like box outs and side panels and features of like, you know, the 3 tips you must do for spring, and there's just too much going on. But with us, it's like, first of all, it's just an email from me, so there's no template at all. And all I do is I tell a story. So, you know, in our industry, I'm trying to find a recent one. So I might tell that story about how okay, so there's something called this week I learned there was something called the IKEA effect, and the IKEA effect is the idea that people place high value on things they partially created. So if you make a piece of furniture yourself, you love that piece of furniture because you made it. So then it might just go into like, you know, some ways you can use that in your job. So maybe letting other people be involved in your projects or something like that. So it'll just start off with a story about that, or maybe the fact that Prince had like 50 fully completed music videos with like lights and choreography and smoke and machines just locked in a vault, right? So he would make all these like these works of art, and then you just keep them and never release them. And I'd say, you know, I think that's true in our industry. We often just we're afraid to ship our work. We're afraid to put it out into the world. And so it's like 200 or 300 words, you know, just a little story, a bridge into something that's relevant to them, and then a little call to action. and it doesn't sell us at all. It doesn't kind of talk about what we do. But they just drip through every week, and then what happens is that you get someone who replies, and they'll say, can we? Oh, by the way, I've looked at your website. Can we talk about a project? And then you go and look at who that person is, and you realize they've been like subscribed for like 2 years. This one guy, a big transport company, he'd been in our sequence for like 2 years and just steadily getting this stuff. And then out of the blue one day, he just comes up and goes, right, I want to talk to you about working together. And that turned into like, now he's spent with us about £100,000, which is a big job for us. And all that just came through about this constant, relationship that was being built through these stories. Every once a week, he would just be taken away from his job for like 2 or 3 minutes by these little vignettes from Prince or NASA or.
And did you have the call to action you mentioned in the email? Was it to what was it to get in touch with you guys, to read a blog post, to do what?
No, like I've changed it now, but for a long time I didn't have any call to action. So I'd have like my email signature, and in that I would say, getting in the email signature would sort of say, hey, we are this agency, we do all this, get in touch if you want to hit reply, if you want to talk about that. But in the body of the email, I'd never like talk about, us. I'd always just talk about either the kind of hero, the story I was telling, or the person reading it. So I'd never talk about us. And I think like that's what helped us, because a lot of our list growth came from people forwarding these emails on inside their team. I went to a bank once. I won't say which bank, but like one of the big UK banks, and they'd actually printed out these emails and they had them in the binder.
Wow!
and it wasn't because like of me, but it was because just these stories, they thought they were really interesting and they applied to their role, and they would show them to people, and they'd literally, I remember it so clearly, they showed me and they printed it out and they had it in a binder. And that's the power. And sometimes you get people who complain that they didn't get it one week, and to me that just illustrates the power of these.
That's interesting.
Stories because people complain that they don't receive what's essentially marketing.
Yeah. So I was going to say, so one other kind of important thing here is, were you, the stories and the points you were making, were they all kind of, they touched a kind of hot button that you believe your target customers have? So it could be so part of it is still about understanding who your target customers are, what their, needs, their pains, their desires, and all that stuff is, and then making sure that the stories you tell connect in some way to what these people are going through with their own jobs or lives. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so you're trying to look for what nerve you can, what heartstrings you can, I know this sounds a bit cynical, but what nerve you can strike with someone, because people just want to be understood, and not many people give them that. Like if you think of a HR director, okay, so someone who is, you have the term HR in the States, don't you? That's the thing.
Yeah, we just call it HR now because I've been Americanized.
HR. HR. So what I found, like, and I did some interviews with some of these people to kind of find out what they actually care about, because there's a difference between a lot of people talk to the role when they should talk to the soul. So that's actually a kind of chapter in the update to the book that I'm doing at the moment. Talk to the soul, not the role. But when they're talking to an audience, they talk about what they think. Like writers talk about what they think that person should be interested in. So like in the case of a HR director, it would be like attracting and retaining high-performing talent, or the challenges they're grappling with are, setting the right attrition rate for employees and all that kind of stuff. The stuff you see on LinkedIn. But that's not really what they care about. What they really care about is the kind of emotional stuff that's just under the surface. So an example is, like, if you're a HR director, you're always seen as the bad cop. You know, you're always delivering the bad news. But what people don't realize is that you're trying to land these blows. You're trying to soften the blows often. So if you're having to make lots of people redundant, you're actually, what they'll tell you is that they're trying to do it in a nice way, in a kind of less damaging way as possible. And it's the directors who are kind of telling them what to do, you know. So HR always delivers the bad news, but whenever there's any good news, it's the CEO who wants to deliver that himself. So they often have this hang up about being seen as the bad guys. And not many people understand that. So when I talk about that in my messaging to them, it's like I'm their best friend, you know, and that's such a powerful, like, and you know, there's not, if you just know some of these people, you know what they kind of talk about when they've had a couple of beers. So whenever you can play on that's very powerful. So I look for stories or anecdotes that allow me to play on those themes.
Good stuff. All right,
and it's very easy to do. Yeah, very easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's wrap up. Let's get on to the lightning round. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. Just try to answer them as quickly as you can. Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the best piece of business advice that you've ever received?
You can't strike oil by digging 10 one-foot holes.
What book, apart from yours, would you recommend to our audience, and why?
I think it's the one it's the War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
And why? Oh, you kind of talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's because, like, a lot of what stops us being successful is ourselves. You know, how do you kind of step out of, like, we're waiting for inspiration to strike, and I don't know. Like, he just talks about how to actually get stuff done in a very practical way. So I really like that, and it's really good if you kind of consider yourself a little bit creative as well. I recommend that.
What's one attribute or characteristic in your mind of a successful entrepreneur?
I think it's such a boring answer, but listening. Like, people do not listen. They just steamroller over an audience with what they want to tell them, and they don't bother to find out what that audience, what that market actually wants to hear. And if you can just dial that in correctly, if you can just dial that in right, you're pushing an open door.
What's your favorite personal productivity tool or habit?
I think mine is when I write, I use a program called iWrite. I think it's called IA Writer. It's one of these distraction-free writing tools, and it just gets rid of everything, and all you can see is the text. And for me, that's how I kind of crank things out, and how I write. Because I've got, like, some small children, and when the other tip, I suppose, is when like, I have to kind of when they go to bed, they want me to stay outside the door. You know, like, Daddy, you still there? Yeah, shush. So, and I do a lot of writing on my phone. You know, when I wrote my book, I wrote most of it on my phone in those, like, 15 minutes that I'm crouched outside the door. And what I do is I kind of just get it all down, and most of it will be absolute rubbish, but some of it will be okay, you know. And later on, you kind of piece it together, and you just cut the rubbish and keep the good bits. And I've found that I can be very, very productive by actually just using those tiny windows of time just to kind of get all my thoughts down in my phone and then editing it later. And that's something I talk about in my book. You know, you have to kind of get out of your own way sometimes to be able to produce stuff. What's
a new or crazy business idea you'd love to pursue if you had the extra time?
Well, one thing I'm doing at the moment is I've started a project to help businesses or people tell their story through a comic, so through a graphic novel. So I'm working with this guy who's like a Marvel. He works on Marvel Comics, and yeah, the idea is we can kind of tell your story as like a graphic novel, because I'm not like a big comics person. I don't like go to Comic-Con or anything. I don't know anything about them really, but there's something about a graphic novel that you just have to read. I don't know what it is, you know. So I think that, yeah, it's called Comic Works, comicworks.co.uk. So that's my next thing.
Cool. What's an interesting or fun fact about you that most people don't know?
Well, recently I got a call from someone who turned out to be from the Donald Trump presidential campaign, who had read my book, and wanted to know if I would be interested in, helping out with the campaign, maybe kind of like some storytelling stuff and some messaging work.
Wow.
I got this call from a 212 number, this New York number, and I rang it back, and it was like the Donald Trump campaign, and they were like, they had no idea who I was. I was like, oh, okay. But then they rang back later and like, oh yeah, we know why. Someone read your book, and we had we had a chat. I decided to kind of, it's not for me in the end, but yeah, it was still quite funny to get to get that call.
That's a funny story. That's another one for your swipe file.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's a good intro to my book.
Wow. And finally, what is one of your most important passions outside of your work?
Do you know what? I don't really have any. I've got no.
Thanks for your honesty.
One day I'd like to kind of make trance music or electronic music, but because I love how like artists and DJs like Eric Prydz can tell a story just with like 4 notes, I just find it amazing how they can do that, but I've no musical talent whatsoever. So for the moment, just finding stories and kind of finding out new and interesting ways to keep people's attention. That's my passion.
Great. Cool, Ian. Thank you for sharing your experiences and kind of helping us learn about storytelling. The book is called Hooked on You, and it's available in the Amazon Kindle store. Sorry, go ahead.
Just one more thing. If anyone's thinking, oh, how do I get all the, I don't have any stories, and like, I'm actually happy to share my swipe file with people, all the stories I've collected. I've kind of just put it into like a Word document so people can have it. It's very, very messy, but if you have a look, if you have a rummage through there, you should be able to find it. And if you go to my website, which is ianharris.com, then like if you put your email in there, then like the second or the first email you get has that in. And then if you want to, you can like unsubscribe. You don't have to get more messages, but that might be a good way to get started if you're just wondering how to kind of
Cool.
kick it off. Then I'll share all my stuff with you.
And if folks want to find out about your company Gatehouse, they can go to gatehouse.co.uk. And what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
They can, probably the best way, just through my website, which is ianharris.com, or you can email me, which is ian@ianharris.com. I used to be Ian Harris on Twitter, but there's another Ian Harris in New York who's like a rapper, and I sold him my Twitter name. And so, and I had like 40 followers, but he took it over. And what's funny is that now he started tweeting like, hey, what's up, my N-word? And people are like, Ian, is that you? What's up, bitches? I'm like, no, it's a new Ian Harris. So if you want to look, so I'm not on Twitter. Don't go there. Go to my website.
Cool. Ian, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. And thanks for having me on, Omar. Yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Cheers. All right. Thanks for listening. You can get to the show notes for this episode by going to conversionaid.com/118. That's 118. If you enjoyed this episode, then please take a minute to leave a review on iTunes. Your reviews really do count. They inspire and motivate me to do better, and they help the show get discovered by more people. So you can head over to conversionaid.com/iTunes for the fastest way to find the show in iTunes. Thanks for listening. Until next time, take care.
Thanks for listening to Conversion Aid, the podcast that shows you how to take your business to the next level and create software that sells. But things don't have to end here. Head over to conversionaid.com/VIP and get yourself on the free VIP list, where we share special insider content and news about upcoming episodes. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you next time.